The more that we can continue to get the story out across the enterprise, the more that we can connect with the business and have them coming to us with ideas. Candidly, that's a great problem for us to solve.
Welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engagement.
Well, Leilani, thank you for joining me on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
It's exciting to have you here. You are at Securian. What's your role there, and what are you doing these days?
I joined Securian Financial about 2.5 years ago, and I lead half of their innovation lab. So I lead the user experience, marketing, and insights portion of the lab. And at the core of who I am and what gets me up in the morning and drives my passion is I'm a builder at heart. And so being incredibly curious, being able to start from the beginning, really connect with the customers is really at the core of my skill set and what I get to do every day, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, what's some of the typical stuff you do, trade secrets aside, but some things you do in the lab, like what are some of the projects and things that you do there? Like what are typical kind of week by week stuff you're doing?
I would say that most weeks aren't typical.
Because
of innovation and also, things change quickly, environments change quickly, which is fantastic. Anything from partnering with certain business partners on net new innovative ideas or tools and technology that are coming out, and they want to run initial pilots or tests or POCs, to helping with like the strategy of how to best connect with the audience, to building out full use cases that support an MVP net new product and platform, which is one of the projects that we have in the lab as well. And so we have quite a few different projects with different timelines that are happening, and that's also what makes it really exciting and fun.
How did you get into the technology space? Were you a builder at one point, or were you like, I'm going to go to college and be an innovator?
No, I had a really interesting background when it came to college. Initially, I thought that I would be in the medical industry and kind of in the pre-med style program, and that wasn't a great fit, and I had taken some time off of school. And when I ended up becoming a digital project manager through a sequence of events, I really found my sweet spot in my home. I love digital, the pace of change, the different creatives and people that I get to work with. And then my career has just kind of grown since then. So educationally, have the MBA, the marketing now in the background. Currently enrolled in the Stanford in Innovation and Entrepreneurship professional certificate. So I'm not done with school yet. The curiosity and the learning side of me is still definitely going strong, but it's been a fantastic journey, although not a straight path by any means. Yeah,
well, they say that the minute you stop being a leader is the minute you stop learning, right? Is the minute you stop trying to become better at what you're doing. So I'm really excited to have you here because something you and I connected on early was the idea about storytelling and the importance of it, and especially through the idea of these typical nomenclatures of digital transformation, change management, and portfolio all this, the corporate-y sort of stuff. But I think both you and I think this is where we're kind of kindred spirits, is that we understand that a lot of that connective tissue between all those things is in how you're narrating what's happening, the communication side of things. One thing I say at Foundry all the time is before we ship any design or code or anything, communication is the deliverable. Right. If we're not shipping communication every day, we're not doing our job. So what's been your experience in understanding the power of storytelling in sort of innovation and change? Why did you get so focused on that idea?
It's been really interesting. Now, this is the second company that I've been with and have been fortunate enough to be a part of bigger enterprise transformational change and change in the digital space as well. And what I'm really coming to a firm opinion around is that technology is just probably the simplest piece of that transformation. It's really the people and the culture that take the most effort. And if there's not a really clear, concise vision or story of why the change is needed, is happening, why the employees' engagement and support of that is so critical, and leadership support of that is so critical. Just to say we need to change for the sake of change, it doesn't resonate with people. It's nothing that they can hang on to or really get behind. And as I've continued to delve into how I can help the organization, help associates even beyond my team understand the why and help us change faster, because of course that's always what we want to do, is to drive change faster and adoption faster. And a lot of that comes down to the individuals. You need that compelling story of why. And more importantly, like, why are they a key component in helping us actually change faster? And so, and also the way that I've seen the stories being told to me, I think that there's sometimes opportunities there as well around being transparent, but not just saying we're going to be transparent and we're going to change, but again, telling us what is the vision for that, even if you don't know exactly what that looks like.
Something.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I found in my past that certain people in leadership roles, again, it depends on the organization, but I've definitely run into plenty of folks who have been like, well, just more is better. Like, that's the vision, you know, like cut costs, increase revenue. There's your vision. Yeah. Go execute on that, you know. And while, you know, that might be the end result you're looking for, that's not really a vision, right?
No.
So how do you coach people on the vision side of things? Not necessarily that they're fighting against you, but maybe they, you know, to people, sometimes doing stuff feels like forward momentum. Mm-hmm. So why don't we just do some things, Leilani? Like, why do we have to stop and like think about it? How do you coach people around that?
One of the things that I always try and anchor to is data and metrics. Like, what can we measure? Why are we measuring it? And is it really important? And so the more that we can kind of anchor to some of those non-emotional components of exactly like, what are we trying to drive and why, oftentimes the metrics come into it. So for productivity, are you actually trying to drive a certain outcome? And if so, let's understand why, and we can kind of back into what's behind that. You know, is it truly some sort of supply chain issue? Mm-hmm. Is it, you know, something of our own processes that are getting caught up in the way of, you know, making the endpoint sticky or difficult? Understanding more of like what is happening behind it. Are there other pressures that they're feeling from maybe their partners, other parts of the organization, externally, regulatory bodies? Like, that helps us kind of shape the conversation and also gives more information around the story of like why. And sometimes the why of doing stuff is because a regulatory body says we have to by the state.
Right.
That's also a valid response, but knowing that that's what's driving it is also helpful in our prioritization and how we put effort behind things. But in general, there's usually, if you dig deep enough, there's an impact to an end customer or to a partner or to our internal associates that is pretty big and something that most people will be able to rally around if we tell that story in the correct way, versus just saying we need to cut costs or go faster or do more, because that's not good direction for people. And so being really clear, you know, one thing I've kind of really anchored to as I've dug more into the Brené Brown readings, which I'm a big fan, is the clear is kind. And so be as kind as you can, be clear, because that helps everyone understand exactly what you're saying. We can rally behind it. We can help unpack it, maybe find a better path forward. But that really clear, concise communication, I think, is key. And there's opportunities in corporate America where we tend to pack too much language around a message that could be potentially shorter and more concise.
Yeah. So many people consume communication in so many different ways. And a lot of organizations for a long time have just assumed, well, email is our standard communication. So an email goes out, you have been communicated to, thank you very much, and move on. You know what I mean? But for you, has there been certain types of storytelling that has been really successful for you in getting messaging across? Is it the medium? Is it the message? Like, what is it for you that you've seen successful in actually kind of changing that narrative?
And some of the innovation projects that we've been driving, it's been most helpful to really anchor to the stories between for our end customer that we're trying to serve with those projects. And so really telling the stories about what their day-to-day looks like in relation to us and a company and financial services to help us feel more connected, to truly empathize with what they're going through and everything that they have on their plate in any given day, to understand what role we play in that. Are we making their lives easier? Are we actually adding to the frustration overall? Like, are we hurting or helping? And so being able to really speak to what that end customer is going through and what role we play in their daily journey and in their like emotional journey that they go through on a day-to-day basis has been impactful. There's been other times too when you're pitching an idea to senior leadership or sometimes just trying to get things unstuck. The story can evolve around like, these are the core principles that we've defined as an organization that are important to us, and reframing us maybe getting a project unstuck by saying, these are our core principles. And if we want to live these core principles, this is how we can actually do it and show it. And so I think it depends on what the scenario is and what you're trying to move forward or communicate, but kind of re-anchoring back to either the core principles and foundation or who we're trying to serve can be really powerful, and getting buy-in and support.
Innovation to people just seems like, oh, you just come up with new stuff all the time, right? But I know that in organizations like yourself and other innovation organizations that I have the pleasure of working with, a lot of times it's about improvement or about the next gen or next version. Right. I mean, how do you think of innovation? Like, how do you explain it to people when they say like, so you work in innovation? Like, no, I'm not thinking up the next new iPhone. No? Most days. But isn't that what innovation is? It's phones and things?
I think at the core of what innovation is looking at problems through a very human-centered approach, breaking down barriers, taking people out of their common roles and parameters within their roles to allow them to think differently, work differently. Candidly, a big part of it is the culture of perfectionism. So walking away from that and like understanding that it doesn't have to be perfect to be an idea to start to unpack and delve a little bit deeper into. But candidly, like sometimes in an organization, innovation can just be adopting new tools and technology. And if we can pressure test those tools and tech and prove that we can utilize them within parameters in the lab, right, and that we can use them safely and securely, we're also allowing them to scale across the organization. So some of what we're actually doing in the innovation lab may not be innovative to everyone else out in the industry, but it's innovative to us because we haven't breached those barriers just yet. And so some of it's really focused around tools and technology, and we kind of take the approach of the horizon. So H1, 2, and 3, like where on the horizon should we be playing? And can we identify a couple of those areas that really align to our strategic objectives, to the risks, whether they're internal or external risks for our organization, and to our core business. And so innovation, I think, is one of those really squishy terms, but at the core of it is, I think, the way that you approach the problems and the cross-functional, really collaborative teams that you bring together to start to break them down and dig into them, and you come up with really creative ideas on the outset. So you work in what you refer to as an innovation lab, right? Mm-hmm. What happens where have you seen success or failures, either in previous roles or whatever, or things you try to avoid? Because, technically you want kind of everybody in the business to innovate, right? You kind of want everybody to do that. So how do you regulate kind of having this sort of off to the side, but core to the company, right? Innovation team going on. And then how do you celebrate what
the other folks are doing out there. How have you found success or seen people, maybe you've got some tips on what to watch out for, like in how to, that one person that's working, 3 floors down, he's got this new idea for paper clips and I'm we're going to remove paper clips from the company and stuff. And I've got this crazy innovative idea. How have you seen success, or what advice would you give people what to watch out for in that sort of scenario?
Yeah. I do feel like one of the ways to connect the innovation labs to the business is to look at opportunities to either solve business problems or to help them look at some H2 and H3 opportunities, like really innovative and disruptive opportunities that anchor to solving business problems. It just ties us closer to the business versus necessarily keeping us out, on our own island and disconnected and candidly looked at as like just a cost center or an expense for the organization.
Because you're not a skunk works. Like you're not creating some whole new lines of business that are like in a completely different industry because they're throwing money at it, right?
Correct.
But I think sometimes people think that is what's going on in an innovation lab, is that, while you might be working in insurance, like you're coming up with the next, credit card or something. Right. I don't know.
Yes. No, we don't currently have any of those projects on the roadmap. Like I said, some of it is the technology piece, so helping the organization advance in the technology side, which does play out into huge efficiency gains from an associate perspective. So if you can help automate like QA automation and do some of these other things, like candidly, you can just do more with the staff. Like they can actually accomplish more. So there are ways to anchor back to driving true positive impacts on businesses and candidly like revenue as well in those efficiencies. There's always the opportunity to look at things that are farther out that could be disruptive, but looking for opportunities where you're kind of distributing your work around, are you solving true business problems as well and adding value to the business, I think allows the labs to not be seen as just an expense for the company or something that's maybe too far out there to rally support at an organizational level. And you're right, we at the core want to actually have innovation happening everywhere. We want the good ideas to come from everywhere. And part of how we're doing that at Securian Financial right now is we have team members from the lab that are actually supporting other projects throughout the organization. So not all the projects are just specifically in the lab. Some of it is actually us taking our talent and embedding them in other teams. And so there's opportunities for us to actually serve the broader organization without having everything happen.
But you've got boots on the ground, as it were, right?
Yes, correct.
So they can bring those opportunities up, or they can be people that are telling that story in that team, right?
Yeah. And candidly, we're always looking for those partners in our business that come to us, say, I have an idea, or I just have something that I want to unpack with you. Like, can we just take an hour of your time? And it's, candidly, those hours are so much fun when they're like, hey, this is the problem we're seeing out in our line of business or on the horizon. And we just want to have a different type of conversation and a different lens of looking at it. And through one of those conversations, we actually came up with the idea and our problem statement that we're going to be focusing on for our first Makeathon. So it's a type of hackathon event. And that's exactly what we're looking for. So the more that we can continue to get the story out across the enterprise, the more that we can connect with the business and have them coming to us with ideas, candidly, that's a great problem for us to solve.
Yeah. So with that, how do you choose, and again, I'm not asking for any insider secrets here, but how do you choose which projects to work on? Is there a baseline? And again, I'm thinking somebody listening to the show, maybe putting together sort of an innovation team, or they're thinking about how to reformat what they're doing already. But is there like a floor where you're like, well, it's got to have at least this much ROI, or it can't touch this part of the business, or things like that? How do you kind of determine, or have you seen over the years, like how to best choose what to work on? Like how, like to your point, okay, so you get all these ideas coming in. Now, do you just like flip a coin? Like,
so there are actually amazing tools out there that for really, really mature innovation teams, you can actually have an entire intake selection and a ranking process and a governance committee around it, et cetera. Candidly, we're not that along in our process.
Most people aren't.
And so oftentimes it's, I think at the core of adding value is how aligned are your projects or ideas with the enterprise strategy and the growth or the risks for the organization. I think having that alignment is key because you are going to align to provide business value or provide insights before the risks really kind of tends to fully form and evolve within the industry. The other part is just finding champions in the business or technology or what other department, because more than likely there's going to be a couple people that are going to align really, really well to being okay to learn with you, being okay that things aren't fully fleshed or it's not a perfectly defined process yet, but are innovative in their own right, are hungry to try something new and a different way of approaching things. And candidly, they're some of your best partners because they're willing to learn and shape this with you and shape the process with you. And then they can become champions with their peers. And so it helps to not only build the brand of the lab itself and be able to talk to what it's like to work with our team, but we're actually providing real business value. So it's a win-win when you can find those champions. And so what I would say is network across your company, like set up those coffee dates, start to talk to people and just understand, like, what are your big strategic priorities for your specific department? What are the biggest risks? Like, what keeps you up at night? And it's amazing how you'll find some of those champions naturally and just, I would say, start there versus trying to spend all this time and effort, because there's amazing systems and tools out there. Most of us are not mature enough in the process to actually warrant those tools.
Yeah. No, I like what you said about going out and just impromptu, research on your own, right? To find out what are other people struggling with, because then if somebody does come in with a good idea and you're like, oh, I remember Bill over here, who's the senior vice president of sales or something, had this idea that was similar to this. I should get you folks together, come up with a brief and a problem statement or something, right? And then let's talk, right? So it can be a way where the innovation lab is kind of the conduit for that sort of stuff instead of just only intake, right? Where you can kind of be the arbiter to go out and make that stuff happen, right?
Correct.
And start that conversations from happening. So in terms of learning, so like you had mentioned, lifelong learner, right? Constantly doing that. What are some resources that you've recently run into that have been really powerful for you? What are some things you've been doing lately other than obviously the next degree?
I cannot tell people enough about the Brene Brown Dare to Lead book. It is fantastic. If you're in any sort of changing environment or driving change, leading teams, even if you're not necessarily driving change, but just leading teams, like, it's such a valuable book. I've brought it into my leadership cohort. They're now working through it, and there's great downloadable workbooks that you can bring into more like book club type of settings with it. It's just really valuable and timely. And when it comes to change and getting people a little bit more comfortable with being vulnerable to take risks and actually drive change, and innovation plays into that as well. A lot of that psychological safety and safe spaces to be vulnerable, to be able to fail. Like, there's so much of that as a foundation. And candidly, there's so much shame attached to failure that when teams and organizations are always like, fail fast. And you're like, what does that mean? And you have a high performing team or person and they fail and they feel really shameful around that. And so it's been just such an insightful book. And as I'm sure you can tell, I'm really excited about it. So I'm like, I think it's valuable for anyone and everyone to read. I've actually gone back through the audiobook. I'm an Audible fanatic. And so there's been portions that I've listened to multiple times to kind of re-anchor to, like, yes, this is fantastic. And this is the why. And that one's just been probably my number one at this point in time. I really loved Michelle Obama's Becoming. again, talking about leading through adversity and change. It was fantastic. And via Audible, she narrates the book. So it's kind of like she's telling you her story personally, which I think is always lovely. It's really powerful, and just seeing how she, as a strong female professional, also navigated a lot of the career changes and family changes, and also put really defined boundaries up for herself, has been really an insightful and valuable book that I would also highly recommend. There's been a few others that have just been more reading for pleasure, but I've always gained some insights around that. If anyone's a Rachel Hollis fan, The Girls Stop Apologizing, I think, is a fantastic one. Yeah. Again, it's really key to setting defined boundaries and making sure you're really driving after what is your personal priority. And I think a lot of women actually need to hear that that's okay, and to walk away from it. And it was funny, I'm an Elevate member, and at our last Friday coffee, we brought up the fact that, like, not every mom likes to volunteer at her kid's school, which I know might get me in trouble, or other people for saying that, or for her. And so there was a couple moms around the table that were like, oh my gosh, me too. But, just allowing yourself those boundaries and helping you really figure out what your priorities are and driving towards those, and what gets you passionate, and like what makes you want to wake up in the morning and dive into it, has been a really fantastic book as well. So yeah,
I like it.
I'm an Audible junkie, so the more books I can get and listen to on my commutes to and from work, I tend to consume a lot of my content that way.
Yeah, I think I've talked about it on the show before, but finding the right vehicle for you as you grow, and if it's reading or audiobooks, or if it's like me doing a podcast, finding those things and trying different things, I think is super important to keep an open mind around those things. Like you mentioned, being part of the Elevate network, that's awesome, because that's another place where I'm sure you also learn a lot from, right? You can only learn so much from staring at a book, but then you go out and meet with other, talented women, and you can learn a lot from them too, right? Yeah, for me, like I said, the doing the show has been the way that I learn the most these days. I still love to read and, watch videos and do all that stuff. But honestly, like, the more I do the show, like, the more I learn and the more I get out of it. So I encourage everybody to go start a podcast. It's a great, even if you never publish it, you can just record it and listen to it later. Okay, so the last thing I want to circle back on is that idea of innovation and communication. I've heard people say innovation is communication. Like, it literally, it's one and the same. That you can't just create stuff in a vacuum and have it have any life or success or impact in the end. If you were to give advice to somebody who's, they're in a place of change, needs to happen, change must happen, and it's probably something a little bit outside of the norm for what they're used to. What are some, obviously going and chatting with people and finding out what their real problems are, but what are some things tactfully that you've done and you've seen success with when you're kind of talking about what the change is going to be and what's going to come? Because people are scared, right? They would lose their jobs. I just did a talk recently where somebody had asked me about, like, how do you reward failure? And I said, well, make sure, first of all, your work is broken up as small as it can be. Because if something explodes and it fails, at least it wasn't a 6-month project you were working on, right? But how have you seen in ways where you can make that change happen, and that story happen all at once? Like, where do you begin? Like, do you just start writing? Like, do you just start talking to people? Like, how have you found success in making that change start?
I feel really fortunate that I have a really good partner in the innovation lab. So Brian Oberman leads the engineering department, and he and I are like very different but very similar. And so oftentimes when we are crafting our why and really trying to get clear and concise on that story, whether it's for peers, whether it's for our teams, whether it's for senior leadership, whether it's because we want to do something, getting together to really craft that why and having us be able to bounce things off each other and challenge each other. And it's a fantastic partnership in the sense that we don't often agree, but we're able to come to a consensus and continue to drive forward. And so, that's what I really appreciate about him, is that it isn't just a yes partner. It's someone that actually continually challenges me to think and do things differently, and vice versa for me with him as well. And so what comes out of that as we're crafting our why or our business case or our use case or our like reason for change, I find that it's really valuable to do that with another person versus in isolation.
Right.
Or if needed, sometimes time constraints are really tough. So one of us will start with a draft, but then we'll come together and just tear it apart, rewrite it, redo it, and then start to shape up the story. And usually it's for leadership. Sometimes it's for our partners. But if you can find someone that you can really disagree with that has a very different lens and take on things, but that you can also find solid consensus and drive forward, like that's an amazing thing to have. And I've been fortunate to have Brian at Securian Financial, and I had, Becky Burley and a couple of the other, Kara Paymar and a couple other partners like that at Capella previously. And so my recommendation is find your person, find your person within the company, the one that challenges you, but that you also work really well with. And oftentimes you're able to create that rhythm together. Yeah,
because I think in that, it's trust is really important. That because us as humans, right? I mean, I don't mind the idea of being challenged or all that stuff, but I also have to trust that it isn't about an agenda somebody's trying to push through. Like I have to trust that they want to swim the same direction as me, but right now they think that we should go left and I think we should go right. So I think, to your point, I would add on to that, like, find people you trust, but aren't yes people, right? That they want something good too, but maybe they've got different ideas. And find ways to work with them, right? Make that happen. No, I think that's great advice. I would do that in the past too. I was fortunate working at a large company. Like I could find like a half a dozen people who would disagree with me, and I could get them in a room and talk through, why are you disagreeing with me? What are the ways? How can? I need to sharpen this message over here and trim this one here and make this one a bit more descriptive. Right. Instead of because I think there is a perfectionist nature in us builders. Like we want to show our work when it's done, not when it's in progress. Right. Because that can be embarrassing. Right. That can. And it's interesting as we've looked for team members for the lab. That has been something that we've had to level set across every single resource that comes in. So UX, design, like really practicing lean UX, really practicing like getting feedback early and often when your designs aren't fully cooked, when your copy isn't fully cooked, when you're just kind of defining your hypothesis to test, et cetera. And so throughout that culture and having to lead and seek out individuals that are comfortable in that type of environment, not only really kind of formed Brian's and my relationship, because he's been at Securian years and years, and I was newly brought into the organization, but we had to practice that. And I think our team seeing us work through those challenges and work through those disagreements, come to a consensus and move forward. Like sometimes that happened very much in our Agile Scrum teams front and center. Also creating the environment where we want them to challenge each other as well. Right. And so that psychological safety is a core component of the success of our lab team, which means that we have to be really vulnerable and show up in our authentic selves, have those conversations, own when we dropped the ball or failed, be okay with that, and also model how to fail for them. And so I think those are some of those just key components that as leaders, you have to be really vulnerable and show how to fail and show how to celebrate the successes and the learnings out of the failure and move forward. Otherwise, your team is never going to feel comfortable or confident that they're not going to have repercussions for failure. Well, Leilani, I want to thank you for joining me today on the show. I learned a lot, as I always do in our conversations, and I appreciate you taking the time to come down here. So if I want to connect with Leilani and I want to see what she's talking about or want to maybe grab coffee sometime, like where are you most active? Where's a great place to find you?
LinkedIn for my professional network is where I'm most active.
Okay.
I admit, not necessarily that active. I'm on Twitter, but not that active, etc. I work downtown St. Paul, so if people like coming over to the east side, there's some really great little coffee shops, etc.
Yeah, and your offices are all newly renovated and part of there.
We're working through really the tower floor by floor, and
That's
so
cool.
quite a bit has been overhauled and is really beautiful.
Yeah, it looks great. Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, thank you, Leilani, for taking the time today to come on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
Thank you for listening to The Schmidt List. If you want to learn more about how Foundry accelerates innovation, check out foundrymakes.com. And if you'd like me to speak about establishing a growth mindset at your conference or with your team, drop me a note at kurt@foundrymakes.com. Oh, and the next time you're on the internet, head to iTunes and leave the show a review. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, because sharing is caring. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to the show, and I hope you have a fantastic week.